The moment I laid my eyes upon this little brain doggy in Baldur's Gate 3, I knew I needed to have it. And thankfully, yes. If you so choose, he can be a companion of sorts to your tab in the game. But that simply was not enough. Follow along with me as I attempt to bring this little guy, known as Us, into the real world. Hello, I'm Jess. I'm a sculptor. And this is my first ever YouTube video. So, prepare yourself for some shoddy camera work.
Surprise, help me. Surprise, I'm coming to you. Please help me.
Let's start by conditioning a good chunk of polyamor clay, which I'm just going to warm up with my hands. I just started using this brand called Cosclay, and if you know anything about polyamor clay, then you may know that many artists consider it to be one of the best out there. Out of the package is very hard and crumbly, but once you warm it up and truly test the strength of your hands by squishing it plenty, it will become workable. There are plenty of different ways you can do this. This is just my preferred method. Some people like to use physical tools to roll it out or whatever. There is no wrong, just do. As you can see here, I also like to twist the clay out, then squish it up, and then twist it out again until it starts to become totally conditioned. I also like to take off any jewelry I'm wearing while I condition because the clay kind of likes to build up a residue of sorts on your skin and I do not particularly want to keep it around. Here, I'm grabbing out some trusty wrapping plastic that I'll use to keep my little project in, as well as the little bit of clay I just conditioned to keep everything super soft. Without this wrap, the air will suck some moisture out of the clay, but this is also just another preference of mine. Who knows, it could really just be a peace of mind sort of thing. I like to do this in between my sessions of working. You heard right, I'm already taking a break. Conditioning clay do be sucking. I'm grabbing my trusty tiny little makeup palette I acquired from my time as a makeup artist. Clay likes to sink into the grains of wood, and you'll notice over the course of this video little blobs of oil from the clay developing all over. And this just helps to minimize that mess. It's also very easy to clean and sanitize once I'm done with it. Way easier than cleaning the wooden table, which I still will do afterwards. It's always a very good idea to work with references, and for the sake of this project, I had to be brave and take a look at actual pictures of brains, which was just a little more freaky than the ones we see in Baldur's Gate, but it was a necessary sacrifice. I ended up using a drawn image to work with, as you can see here, to help guide me. It's pretty nicely detailed, and seemed pretty accurate, based on my many first-hand experiences with brains, of course. Moving on, I made a cute little skeleton of the boy, made out of very thin and flexible armature wire, tinfoil, and clay, which I did forget to record. Forgive me, I know, what the heck, Jess? I thought you were showing the whole process. Well, from here on out, there's going to be little else missing, hopefully. Here I'm just grabbing some chunks of clay and placing it on top of the tinfoil where I want his body to be. Let's separate it into two segments, representing each side of the brain, and begin to smooth it out over top. Right now, I'm not worrying about being too accurate. It's better to get the clay down first, and then nitpick on the details when the time is right. Once everything is laid out, I'm going to grab one of my larger silicone tip tools and begin to smooth and taper out the shape of the brain so that each side is equal to one another. While I'm doing this, I'm looking at my reference frequently and the negative space around the brain to make sure the forms are looking right. These are probably my two favorite and most used tools in my arsenal. When I first started sculpting, I signed up to the Stan Winston School for Character Arts online and first began learning about clay through an artist named Don Lanning.
Stone skipping across the water. As I leave the wound, I'm going to come out, do a little extra bump, and a bump, and a bump, and I'm out.
I remember him saying that the square tip tools like the one I'm using here is just about the only one you need, or at least the most important. I can't remember exactly what he said, but whatever he did say, I took as gospel, because the man is an absolute genius of a human being, and I'll always remember his attitude and love for the craft so fondly. Such a joyful person. Here you can see me holding up the very start of a very smooth brain and checking out what areas need attention to get a proper form. I'm still mostly looking at the negative space. Hopefully you can see when I hold it up against the white wall. I'll start correcting things by adding little bits of clay to add mass to areas that need it. This is another silicone tip tool that I hardly ever use, to be totally honest with you. I just picked it up recently. The tip of it is rounded, and I imagine it's meant to help shape out more rounded edges to things, but I just think of it as my wrinkle tool. I'm going to use it here to smooth out the divide of the two segments better and in a more rounded way. Now I'm going to smooth out all these little bits of clay I've added to areas of our brain that were needing it with the Don Lanning approved square tip tool again. Once that's all done, I'm going to do another negative space check and see where we're at. Looking pretty good. I'm going to now wrap up our brain in our plastic wrap and call it a day. Carefully, I'm going to unwrap the boy without causing him any sort of damage, because this time I intend to make us without lobotomizing him. Did anyone else do that in the game, or just me? This time around, I'm going to really pamper us. I'm going to give him a bit of extra smoothing with another random tool from my old makeup kit. This one is just a basic palette knife. I find it pretty handy for giving a nice shoe shine effect to things. And now I'm imagining shiny shoes on his feet. Okay, cool. We're now in a good place to start adding wrinkles to our brain. At first, my idea was to use this cool double-sided tool from the sculpture house to carve out the placement of the wrinkles. But to be honest with you, I gave up on doing this nearly immediately. A few seconds into this idea, and I was feeling like it was a totally redundant way of going about it, and anything I made like this would have to be redone anyway. But you never know until you try, and this time I learned my lesson fast. Instead, I decided I would be saving myself a lot of pain by just simply rolling out some worms to begin mapping out onto the body. Now, I'm not particularly good at rolling out worms evenly, but in this case it's going to work to our advantage because I don't want them to look uniform. I'm really looking at the drawn reference I showed earlier, and I'm trying to follow what I see fairly closely. I sculpt out the wrinkles section by section, refining each part I'm working on before I lay down more again. I'm using a tool here that's typically used to carve mass off of a sculpture, but you can see me here using it for several different purposes. That's just another thing I picked up from Don Lanning. He was always fond of saying that anything can be a tool. He was always so amused by it.
In this case, I could take a little bit of, no product placement here, a little bit of MAC lip gloss.
He'd have all these sort of unusual items and be like, this is now one of my sculpting tools. He'd always treat them like it was some kind of magical transformation. And hell yeah, it kind of is. Okay, I swear this is not a Dan Lanning fan video. So, with that tool I'm connecting each edge of the worm down to the smooth part of the brain. I go back in with my silicone tip tool to continue to add shape to the worm. I want it to be more squished looking in some areas. When you look at the reference, I sort of see a pinching effect to the wrinkles on sections, so I want to recreate that look. It just takes some playing around to get to where I want each section to be. I really think the most important part of sculpting, or making anything really for that matter, is just being patient with yourself. This entire part of the sculpture is a very rinse and repeat process, so I'm going to skip forward to different intervals and try to point out anything I might have missed from that first little section. As I go, I'm quickly learning what is and isn't working. Sometimes you'll find new ways to do things that feel better to you. I think it's super common for things to work this way. As I'm laying down the worms, I'm trying to maintain equal forms from the two halves that we shaped out earlier. One side shouldn't stick out too much further than the other. I definitely was double checking all these things pretty frequently. The second side, for example, was a little thicker than the first, and I ended up using my carving tool to take away some volume from each wrinkle. I also used the carving tool to intentionally create some dips into random areas of the wrinkles because it was another cool detail I kind of was seeing in the reference drawing. Okay, nice. I've finally finished with the wrinkles and our brain doggy is looking pretty awesome in my opinion. Now I just need to cut up 4 pieces of armature wire and stick 2 into each side to prepare for the tendril details that our boy has that we will do later on. I could have filmed myself doing this. Unfortunately, I did not though. Now I'm going to put the boy into the oven and follow the recommended instructions for temperature and time as provided by Cosclay so that we can cure what I've made so far. This kind of clay can be baked quite a few times over, and it will be totally necessary for this project so that I can safely hold on to the brain without squishing all of my hard work and also without giving us irreversible brain damage. Which would be huge because he's like 90% brain. And now that the brain is hard, the next detail I want to tackle is the vein details that sticks out on top of the wrinkles. I'm going to use a technique similar to what I did with the wrinkles, but this time I want my worms to be much thinner. I'll start by laying things out while also looking at the reference to figure out what kind of patterns I want to create. I want to keep it similar to what I see in the reference, but since we are working with a smaller scale, sometimes you have to do less so that the details are taking up an appropriate amount of space. When you're putting fresh clay onto baked clay, Generally, you want to lay down some liquid polyamor clay first, so that the clay has a greater chance of sticking to the baked surface. You may notice that I didn't realize I forgot this step until a little later, so later on I ended up adding glue around the sides of what I've laid down, just to be safe. This is my third sculpture I've made with cosplay, and I tend to forget important things like that from time to time still. The way that I worked with polyamor clay in the past was definitely a little different. This is my third sculpture I've made with cosplay, and I tend to forget important things like that from time to time still. I used to always use Sculpey 3 and Fimo, and then one time with Cernit. Cernit was not my friend. When I used Cernit, I was trying to use it for a very sculptural-like piece, where it was supposed to look like a piece of crystal on a creature's back, and the clay I discovered is really, really soft. So in order to work with it, I ended up rinsing my hands into freezing cold water repetitively, putting the super soft clay into the freezer, only for it to warm up again and start to fall down very easily, and it was a very painful process. I remember even trying to lower the temperature of my home as greatly as I could.
Shinichi, that's cold.
Just overall, very uncomfortable. It did end up working in the long run, but it was a pain in the ass, and yeah, I think Cernit is like a nice clay for people who like to make jewelry and other really thin, fine details. Everyone has their own preferences though. I'm excited to continue to work with cosplay and to keep getting better at using it. When looking at the veining details in my reference photos, I noticed a pattern where the veins were generally a little thicker near the top of his head, and then taper down, and then thicken up again, and thin out at their thinnest, generally around the end of the pattern. So, to try to replicate that, here I am just adding a little bit of mass to the top section to give my sculpture a similar look. Now that I've completed one side, I could have baked the brain again before continuing to do the same kind of details on the other side, but I instead just worked very carefully and made sure not to grab onto the veins I just made. Then, once both sides are done, I put the sculpture back into the oven to cure the vein details before moving on again. Okay, nice. Now it is tummy time. Getting reference of Us's underbelly was a little tricky, but the best part of sculpting something from a video game is that you can be creative with collecting information through your own gameplay. There is literally nothing more useful than an actual 3D model to examine. You can walk him around physically as your Tav, or you can examine him and get a beautiful window where you can turn him around fully. And this is where I collected most of my reference photos. However, we still can't get a good look at his tummy. Or can we? Once I realized I could barbarian style pick up Us as Tav and throw him, I was super happy. Even though he becomes transparent in this mode, it still helped give me way more information than I had before. So let's start making these little tummy sacks. I'm going to start off by making two segments, sort of similar to how I sculpted the start of the brain. And hey, this time I didn't forget the liquid clay. Once those pieces are laid down, I'll just start by blending the edges down. Then I'll take my carving tool and begin to roughly sculpt and cut out the outer shape I want. I'll often either poke my tool into the glob of conditioned clay I'm pulling from at the side, or I'll use my fingers to get clay out of my tool. Either works. Now I finally have some footage of me using this tool for its true, destined purpose. It's pretty satisfying watching it refine and subtract mass. I'll slowly whittle the shape down and get it to the volume and shape I want each little section to be, but this is just a rough start. Before I really perfect it, I need to also go around the edges and create a sort of convex and curved edge around the shape. Taking your time with the form always comes first before getting things to a pretty looking finish. The smooth part of his underbottom isn't as smooth as I would like it to be, so I'm going to add just a small bit of clay to clean up the look of this area now as well. Now that the tummy forms are looking ready, it's time to add in some texture. I'll start by using the pointy side of this tool, drawing in light lines in segments of 3 directions on each side. I thought of it as having each half having its own half of 2 sides of horizontal lines that ends more than halfway down and then save space for the bottom section to have some vertical lines. Did that make sense? Anyway, you'll see me go over lines and create more in between a few times. I also went in with my fingers to make the detail look a little more organic and less harsh looking. Sometimes there is no greater tool than your finger to make things look more natural. Now that I've taken those details as far as I can, I'm going to pull out some isopropyl alcohol, or rubbing alcohol, to start smoothing out this section, and detail it further. You'll see me here using 99%, simply because 70% has become a lot harder to find ever since the hand sanitizer craze from the pandemic years ago. Isopropyl Isopropyl alcohol is a disinfectant, but it has several different uses for artists as well. In this case, it will help soften the textures I've created. I'm careful not to use too much alcohol or brush away too much detail, because it is disintegrating the clay a little bit as we work with it. I also use my brush to stipple lightly onto the surface of the tummy to create additional texture. After all of this, it's time for another break before we move on to what may be the most challenging part of this sculpture, the legs. So if you haven't for some reason noticed already, the length of the wire for each leg is quite long. It's definitely a lot longer than necessary, but I wanted to be in a position where I was better safe than sorry. It's time to start thinking about giving the legs a trim though, and to do so I'm taking my sculpture and measuring it against my reference to see how long the leg should be. And then once I have that measurement, I'm going to fold up the wire where his feet should end. Before I begin slapping clay onto the legs, I want to first bulk them out a small bit by wrapping tinfoil as tightly as I can around the wire. I'm not very good at this, but I do my best. I then begin to reshape the legs into a final pose that I like. If you ever pay attention to Us in the game, he is quite a stretchy guy. Like literally, sometimes he stretches out like a dog and can make himself quite long. You can also catch him as he stretches upwards like a cat. But generally, he seems to keep his legs tucked pretty close to the floor and moves in a way that I can only describe as a manic shuffle. So close to the floor he's going to stay. The progress of the leg jumps forward quite a bit here, but I just want to share this moment of bravery where I make another permanent move to progress the sculpture further by cutting the wire. Truly a proud moment. I end up cutting just a little shorter than where his toes end because it will be less of a fight to make things work, especially when it comes to adding in his claws a little later on. Once 3 legs are done, I tried to film the whole step-by-step process I went through to create these little beast legs. When wrapping up the legs, I had to be careful not to use too much tinfoil as well, since the legs are quite thin and we want to be able to take away bulk later without too much of a hard barrier. Now that the tinfoil is wrapped around the leg, I begin to wrap a very thinned out layer of clay to cover up the whole length of the limb. I'm not sure the liquid polyamor clay was totally necessary, but maybe it helped somehow. I at least know it was especially important to include the liquid clay at the base of the leg, where the tummy connects, since the clay there has been cured at this point. It's a bit of a tedious task to get the leg slimmed out. I begin by pulling excess clay to the base of the leg to clean up that area, while occasionally stretching the clay out with my fingers and using my other tools. I used one of my tools to measure where the length of the leg should end so that they are equal, and I still end up cutting a bit below that so that there is some free space with no wire for the very tip of his toes. The goal for now is getting some super thin, Dark Souls looking beast legs for this boy to begin with. It's been a gruesome journey for this little doggy, and he's been a chill guy thus far, so I'm giving him some pets and pats to boost both of our serotonin, but mostly mine. A necessary step if you ask me. Now it's time to start creating his little paws. I measure out where his wrist bones will start by lining up my tool with the wrist of the already completed leg. I'll roll up some small balls of clay to indicate where the bones will be and place them down. Next, it's time to create some worms again, trying to make 2 toes of equal size and one a little shorter and smaller as a third toe. Just like with the brain wrinkles, I'm going to attach everything together. Then I'll flip the sculpture over and do the same thing on the underside of the foot. I'll continue adding bulk where needed and try to keep the overall shape of the foot flared out. The next detail I'm trying to get an indication of is the slight webbing in between his toes. Before I begin shaping out forms further, I get fixated on leveling out all of the legs so that the elbows, feet, toes, and claws are touching the ground. I got super frustrated doing this, and just wanted to include a little bit of footage demonstrating my wrath. I actually ended up having to redo everything I did because I kind of just tore it off after getting worked up over it. In my mind, I had to straighten everything out. I had been making sure that all these placements were touching the ground for the previous 3 legs, and now that I was at the 4th, I really wanted it to be perfect. Not only did I want these areas in contact with the ground, but I thought his brain booty was looking a little crooked, and this grieved me. So after ripping off the clay, I took a break, redid everything up to about the same place I was before, and continued, trying to give myself the space and kindness that I deserved about how well I would be able to accomplish all of these goals. I thought, just get the foot done, and then try to see where you can get then. Forcing yourself to continue to work while frustrated is probably the worst thing that you could do for yourself. As a sculptor, I think there's almost always a moment of frustration with everything you make. It's kind of part of the deal if you want to do this. Just try to remember to walk away and come back in a fresher state of mind when it happens, and be kind to yourself. Leave a comment if you do. That way we can be accountability partners. It's a new day, I'm back, and in a much better place mentally. In the background, I am full out vibing. watching one of Joel Haver's new films on his YouTube channel, and I am super into getting this boy's last leg done. I'm carving out the foot, trying to consider the shape from all angles. I don't want the toes and the top of the foot to be simple round shapes, but instead look clearly like skin sitting on top of bones and muscle. Now that the shapes are starting to look a little more defined, I take a little ball of clay and stick it down as the beginning step for his tiny back thumb. After that, I roll out the thinnest worms yet and lay them down the center of each section of his foot to represent his 3 bones. I use my finger to gently tap in the shape. I want to make it less severe, but not get rid of it entirely. Finally, it is claw time. I'm taking the opposite side of a tool we saw earlier and using the ballpoint on it to press into each toe to create little sockets for the nails. Putting us aside for a minute, I grab another little chunk of clay and roll it between my fingers to create these cones. I then use my nail to help shape them, and use the tools to sharpen them down into the little weapons that they are. I'm using my hands a lot here for greater control as the clay is so soft. There are 4 nails on each hand, 2 being the same size as one another, while the third is a bit smaller, and the 4th minuscule compared to the rest. In order to keep the claws in the shape I just created, I'm going to grab this handy jar I kept that once stored crushed tomatoes, and I'm going to drop in each nail carefully, and heat them up with a hairdryer. This won't cure them fully, but it will harden their shape and make them easier to work with for now. They'll be more brittle than normal since they are undercured, so I'll have to be pretty gentle so that I don't break them. And hey, this is a perfect opportunity for me to rest my back to my chair for once and show off this cool as heck greatsword my partner bought for me. After emptying my cup, I place a bit of liquid clay into each socket so that the nail adheres well enough to the soft clay surrounding it. It's difficult to eye out the perfect matching size for the front 2 claws, so I discarded one after realizing it was just a little too thick next to the others. Sadly, as you can see, my thumbnail broke on me as I tried to get it into place. Time to try again. I legit had to do this 4 times. That thumbnail was giving me the worst luck so far. Sheesh. Happy with the size of all the nails, I start rolling out another very thin worm to wrap around each nail. This will represent the cuticle of Us's claws. I make sure the little worms I laid down are looking right from every angle. Now that Us has got his nails did, I make sure his thumb pad is looking similar to the 3 others I already finished. The hands still need detailing, but before we get to that, let's bulk up the strange little muscles that he has on his arms and elbows, while making sure everything is looking connected to one another. Similar to Us's tummy, I create soft lines at varying angles throughout the tops of the hands, arms, and soles of the feet. Then I smooth and add texture to everything with alcohol again. I'm taking the boy for one last little spin and check, and feeling quite happy with how he's looking. It's oven time again, and then onward to some of the last few details. He's out of the oven, and I'm happy with how his limbs are coming into contact with the ground. He doesn't look too terribly uneven to me. I've made peace with him completely by this point. The next section I want to work on is his back spine details. He has about 6 spikes coming up his back, and I want to see how well all the details will fit and how high up I will have to go. After I do this, I start working on the largest and most detailed spike. Since it is a bit larger, I'm able to use my tools a little more easily. Once I'm pretty happy with the overall shape, I'm going to measure my sculpture up against the reference again to try to see how long his biggest spike should be. I'll cut off just small amounts at a time so I don't cut away too much. In all the reference pictures I've collected, I made sure to capture the little dog from all his angles, but there is something I just couldn't quite see entirely from this largest spine. I could clearly see 3 bottom spikes, but also potentially 2 others at the base of the large spike. So I jumped into the game to confirm what I was looking at. I confirmed I wasn't just seeing things, and I was also able to appreciate some big stretches from the boy. Super glad I did this. Both for that little stretching serotonin boost, and also because I was able to really see where those extra details on the spike were located for certain. So let's get on it. I'll start by just blow drying the main part of the spike so that the smaller details are easier to get on without deforming the shape I just made. I then decide for some wild reason to freehand doing the 3 little bottom spikes together. This admittedly took me an outrageous amount of time, and really could have been done more easily with the hairdryer technique. Maybe it was for the best though, because they are quite small. I made it work, but it was not exactly my favorite part of making this dude. After those 3 spikes are made, I give the piece a quick blow dry before making the final 2 on the base of the spike. Then give those a blow dry as well. It felt pretty nice once it was done entirely, especially knowing that this was the last part of the spine that would be as complicated and time consuming. Once the whole piece is done, I add a bit of liquid polyamor to the brain where it will go, as well as some on the base of the piece, with some soft clay between to help glue it into place. I squish it down, fix the positioning some, and then blend that soft clay into the spike and the boy. I then add 2 spikes to the sides of the base, as well as the remaining spikes that scale down in size as they go up his back. I bake the boy again, and I realized something while he was toasting. Looking at pictures of us, I realized that I got too into things, even though I was staring right at my reference the whole time. I ended up making a total of 7 spikes up the back, when there should have only been 6. Oops. It was pretty easy to fix though, just required some careful X-Acto knife work and some fresh clay to seal up the wound and get rid of any leftover texture from the operation. I have one last section of us to work on after this, and I'm pretty pumped to get there. Because of how much handling this guy has gone through up to this point, the way I had shaped his little tendrils had been altered quite a bit. Thankfully, I did have some pictures of what it was like initially, from the first time I baked him, when I was taking some photos to share on an Instagram story. So I keep in mind what shape was there initially, but I also give myself the space to change anything in any way if I think it works a little better. I want each side to be a little asymmetrical and organic looking, since they're always floating around and doing their own thing in the game. As I do this, I do lots of turns to try to see what looks best from all angles. Alright, now that everything's shaped to my liking, it is time to finish. I will just say though, I only recorded the entire process of me doing this first tendril, and I found that the less liquid clay I used, the better. Since the goal is to get the clay to be a very thin coverage around the wire, the liquid clay, if used too much, would become a giant pain. Things would just get way too gummy and delicate to push around. Each tendril took me over an hour to get to a clean looking place. It took quite a bit of patience to get there, but it was very exciting to see it coming closer and closer to being totally done. Once each wire was covered up and looking pretty good, I do a couple of spins just to make sure each is looking just as thick as the other in size, taking away from any area that looked like it could be better. Then, one final smoothing with alcohol. I use a combination of my fingers and a brush, making sure to clean up any fingerprints made from using them as I went along. It is now officially time to bake the dog one last time, to praise him and to give him unconditional love. Mission Bring Us into the World complete. Let's end this video off with some thanks to my supportive cast of Final Fantasy minions. They're some of the first sculptures I ever made and can be roughly seen cheering me on in the background of this video. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, please consider subscribing. Doing so would mean a tremendous amount to me. My next video will be showing off the painting process of us to totally finish him up. Hope to see you there. If you're keen to see more, you can find me on Instagram at SoClayAboutThis, where I post little updates and behind the scene things pretty regularly, or on TikTok. And until then, Pisa Brat, Goo Goo Sproutling, Sandfox Guy, and viewers, it's been real.